start the recording. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. That's always a good thing. All right, well, welcome to the second special edition of Pigments 101 for this month. And today we are going to focus on colorants for plastics. If you have any questions, please use the chat box along the way, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. And we will be recording this webinar, and all of the participants today will get a link to that recording, as well as the PDF of the presentation. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of specifics about Sudarshan products in this session. However, I did include at the very end of the presentation more specifics for products in each of the color families that are appropriate for plastics. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. So the nice thing about colorants for plastics is pretty much all types of colorants are used in plastics, both from the pigment side as well as the dyes. And in today's session, we will be talking about all of them in this section, both on the organic side as well as the inorganic side. And on the inorganic side, we have several things that we will include, including our newest launch products, which are our CICPs, as well as micas that are appropriate for plastics. So this chart just gives you a general feel for the colorant space that Sudarshan is in for plastics. On the organic side, of course, we have the high performance pigments, along with the classical azo pigments that are available. And of course, the CPC blues and greens, as well as our newly launched line of solvent dyes that we launched earlier in this year. And on the inorganic side, we are just now launching our line of CICP products. So you can see some of the first entries into this portfolio for us. And then as well as the mica effect pigments. We have a number of products to offer that might meet your needs in plastic coloration. So when we talk about plastics, we certainly have to mention the difference between classical pigments and high performance pigments. And the key here is in the heat resistance between these two groups of pigments. In general, the classical pigments, classical azo pigments have a lower heat resistance value than the high performance pigments. This is a generality. There will be some exceptions to these rules, but this is one of the key properties that distinguish the two groups of organic pigments with respect to plastic applications. So the colorant selection process for plastics, of course, starts with the color and the effect that you're trying to achieve with your end application. And then from there, certainly have to take into consideration the application. So what polymer do you need this formulation in so that we can match the appropriate colorant to that polymer from a suitability standpoint. Heat stability, as I mentioned, is always key. Interactions within the formulation. So obviously the colorant is not the only ingredient in your formulation. So we want to make sure that there might not be any interactions with your other raw materials in your formulation. And then finally, as far as the application, is it going to be indoor or outdoor, so that we can appropriately recommend the appropriate light and weather fastness properties for that particular colorant. In terms of the technical performance, certainly some key areas to consider is migration resistance, especially if this is an end application that has food contact. Dispersibility is always important, but is especially important with respect to fibers. We certainly don't want to clog the holes of the spitting mold there to be with a colorant in there. And then particle size is important as well, especially if the end application is a blown film, transparent type of film. And then lastly, distortion as far as the stability of the shrinkage of the part. And then, of course, compliance is always a criteria as you go through and make your checklist, especially if you have your application is either food, toy, or medical. We want to make sure that the colorant is appropriate for that particular application in terms of compliance. And lastly, cost and value. And I have these separate because they are separate characteristics of the colorant. So obviously cost is your straight up dollar per pound figure. However, value can have a couple of definitions. For example, if a higher price per pound colorant provides you with a lot more strength, then you can use less of the high performance or the higher cost pigment and thus get additional value for that particular colorant. Another area as far as value is concerned is if a higher priced colorant provides you with much more additional technical properties, which can then lead to a more versatility in terms of application, that might be another value in use for that particular colorant. So the two go hand in hand as you take a look at your colorant choice checklist. Certainly, it's always going to be a balance of both the performance of the pigment as well as the performance of that colorant in your application. So I'm sure you have, each of you has a checklist of your must, wants, and nice to haves. And it is our job here at Sudarshan to help you make sure that we match up a colorant to check off as many of those must, wants, and nice to haves on your checklist. So we've talked about pigment synthesis in the past, and I've mentioned that the about 75 to 80% of the pigment performance really comes from the pigment chemistry or the colorant chemistry, and the remaining material performance comes from the finishing steps. So there's a lot of that performance is really tied to that chemistry or color index. And then I believe in the June webinar we talked about pigment finishing, and the pigment finishing then makes up the remaining 20 to 25% of the performance. And really the finishing steps, whether it be an additive or surface treatment or a process in the dryer, milling, or blender application, this really just alters the performance of the actual chemistry. So it's not necessarily a huge amount, but it just really alters that performance in one direction or another. With regards to effect pigments, it's very similar. The chemistry comes from the metal oxide that is deposited on the mica platelet, and then the finishing part is really the surface treatment or encapsulation that might be required for that particular application. So there's still an equal impact from both the chemistry and the finishing with respect to mica effect pigments as well. So with regard to the pigments for plastics, when Sudarshan develops pigment colorants for plastics, we really try to keep them as clean and as easily dispersible as possible, because the residence time in the plastics application process is very short. So we want to make sure that the colorant is dispersed easily and quickly to its utmost quality as it is possible. So we typically do not use additives or surface treatments, although this is in general. There might be some that have it. And we also try to use spray dryers or spoon flash dryers in order to keep the colorant particles as particle size as small as possible, as well as being as narrow as possible. So as I said, we want to make sure that the dispersion of that colorant is as quick and as complete as possible in the application, plastics application. As far as testing for colorants, there are a number of test methods that are used when we develop a pigment for plastics. Obviously, color and shade is key and critical with respect to these colorants. But also, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that we check the heat stability so that we can assess how suitable it is for all of the polymers that might be used for this colorant. And along with the heat stability, we also take a look at any kind of limiting concentrations with respect to heat stability, because we want to understand how versatile the colorant is in these polymers. So if there's a particular concentration where the heat stability is altered, we want to make sure that we are clear with that so that we can match up to as much of the polymer applications as we can. Filter index is always key as well. And these are, this is a measure of the dispersibility of the particular colorant, but it is especially important for film and fiber applications so that we can get the dispersion to its the best state possible for those applications. Migrations, as I stated earlier, is very important for applications that might require FDA compliance. Warpage is important for maintaining dimensional stability for those types of applications. And then lastly, film note is another area where we is important for if the end application is in plastic film. We want to make sure that there are no larger undispersed pigment particles that are available in the film. So just a quick review of some of these properties as we go through. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of them, but I did want to give you an idea of how they're tested and some examples as well. So obviously, coloristic properties, the color shade and the color strength are important, and there are a couple of methods that we use at Sudarshan to determine that. Here is just one example of our Pigment Blue 15.3. Here we're comparing it to an industry standard where we take a look at obviously the full tone and the tint tone, and then we also assess it at equal strength as well. And then any additional information that might be required for that particular evaluation. In this particular case, it's the migration for this particular pigment. So for effect pigments, and when we are talking about color, and we are talking about the thickness of the metal oxide and the metal oxide that's used. So the first grouping that I'm showing here are the iridescent mica pigments. That is using TiO2 as the metal oxide, and it's the thickness of that TiO2 that develops the color of the final mica flake, with the silver being the thickest or thinnest, TiO2 layer all the way up to the green, which is the thickest TiO2 layer. And the photos that I'm showing here are just a couple of examples of two iridescent micas, a silver and a gold, dispersed in two different types of plastic polymers, LDP on the left and polypropylene on the right, as well as the dispersion methodologies that are used. So on the left, where we did this with a two-roll mill to prepare these swatches so that it allows the wavy, veiny types of effect to show through from that mica. So you see some of those bright spots and shadow spots along with each of these. And then on the right-hand side is an injection molded part chip that then shows how much more evenly dispersed the micas are in terms of orientation. So the waviness is removed because all of the flakes are equally oriented in a flat position. So you start to see a little bit more of the sparkle and the luster that comes along with it. Now, if we change that metal oxide out to the iron oxide, you get the earth tone color mica pigments, with the bronze having the thinnest layer and the maroon having the thickest layer. And again, you can see the difference in effect that you get by the polymer type as well as the dispersion type. Now, there are many ways to get different colors out of a mica. So when you start to combine multiple layers of different metal oxides, you can continue to expand the color spaces that are available. So here's just a couple of examples where we've combined two different types of metal oxides. On the top, we have the first layer being a yellow iron oxide, and then coated again with a black iron oxide that gives a nice warm brown or walnut color that we can achieve through that combination. And if the layer is a TiO2 layer followed by a black iron oxide, we get a nice gray color that is equivalent to an aluminum in color. So it does provide some alterations or alternatives to some aluminum pigments in terms of color and potentially some sparkle depending on the size that you use. So the iron ox or the metal oxides that are used are many, and the output that we can get is quite large. So for example, we just recently launched our Regal Blue, which is a TiO2 layer, but at the blue stage, followed by a black iron oxide, which gives it that nice smoky, very opaque look to it. So as far as heat stability, again, this is an area where we attempt to assess the suitability in the various polymers that the colorant could be used in. And we express that as the temperature at which for a 5-minute dwell time, the delta E change is 3 or less within that. So here are some examples of a number of color index colorants that have and their heat stability values. So I want to make note with the top one there, the Pigment Red 53-1. Earlier, I had said that there are exceptions to the rule with respect to classical pigments and heat stability. And here's a good example where the Pigment Red 53-1 has a very good response when it comes to heat stability. So it takes, again, it's always a full balance of properties when selecting a colorant for your application. And just to continue that comparison between a classical and a high performance pigment, here we have a yellow 62 on the left-hand side and a yellow 180 on the right-hand side. And we discussed each of these in previous webinars, and I make notation here in the slide as well. But this is a typical TDS that you might see from Sudarshan, so that you can compare the heat resistances between these two very similar colored colorants, so that which provides you with a much greater applicability with the yellow 180 because of its higher heat resistance. And then just a little bit more detail with respect to that. The blue line is the yellow 62, so you can see at 250 degrees C, the delta E surpasses the 3 delta E requirement for heat stability, whereas the yellow 180 maintains a very low delta E all the way up to 300 degrees C, which is the maximum testing for that particular test method. The other thing I wanted to point out to you is goes back to the value of pigments, and you can see that in the strength area for the pigment yellow 62, the classical pigment, it requires 0.4% pigment to reach that 1/3 depth standard depth value. Whereas the high performance pigment, the pigment yellow 180, requires just 0.16% to reach that same standard, a 1/3 standard depth. So there's much more value in using the pigment yellow 180 in two ways. One, because of the strength is much greater, but also because of the heat resistance is much greater. So there's much more applicability with the pigment yellow 180 over the pigment yellow 62 to gain the same color space. Filter pressure value. This is an area where, of course, we are is a measure of the dispersibility, and primarily for film and fiber applications. And this is expressed in bars per gram of pigment, along with the specification of the screen size that is used. So here is an example, is the equipment that we use here at Sudarshan to test the FPV value. And then here is a snapshot of an example of what the testing provides us. So this is an example of a pigment yellow 191 on a 25 micron screen mesh. And the result here is 0.44 bars per gram of pigment in here. So that's a very easily dispersible pigment and good for film and fiber applications. Some examples of filter pressure values based on some color indexes. And at Sudarshan, we have a specification of 2 bars per gram or less on a 25 micron screen for our pigments that are appropriate for film and fiber. So you can see the values here. Migration, as I mentioned earlier, is important if your application requires an FDA compliance, and we rate this in terms of the staining level from a level of 1 to 5, with 5 being no staining and 1 obviously being a lot of staining and unsuitable for that particular application. Again, some examples of migration resistance based on some color indexes. And as I mentioned earlier, the red 53.1 has a very good heat stability property, but in this particular case, it does not pass the migration test. So then that continues to further limit the suitability of the red 53 if you do require an FDA compliance. And then here is an example of how we evaluate one of our products. This is one of our CPC blues, CICPs, which is our Pigment Blue 28. And you can see that our rating is a very good rating with no bleed in this application. Film note, I mentioned earlier that this is very important for film applications. So we also rate this in terms of a 1 to 5 rating, where 1 is excellent dispersion. There are no pigment particles in a set length of film versus going all the way up to 5, which makes it unsuitable. Warpage, again, is a measurement of how much shrinkage is measured based on that colorant choice. And we measure that in terms of the percentage of shrinkage of the part compared to uncolored polymer. And then we convert that into a 1 to 3 rating system, where a suitable pigment would have a warpage rating of 1, which is less than 10% of shrinkage, versus a not suitable pigment, which would get a rating of 3, which would be greater than 20% of shrinkage. And this test is done at 2 different temperatures, a lower and a higher temperature. And here is a listing of some examples of color indexes and their warpage rating. So it's important to understand the versatility of that particular colorant at these both temperatures. For example, the yellow 62 has a good warpage rating at the lower temperature, but falls off significantly at the higher temperature. So it's always important to check off both of these temperature areas for the warpage value. So again, going back to comparing a classical versus a high performance pigment, here we're looking in the orange space with respect to warpage. We have the orange 34 on the left-hand side and the orange 64 on the right-hand side. And the TDS will tell you whether or not it's going to be suitable for warpage or not. And then if we expand that to all important plastic application properties of these 2 particular colorants, we can see that in combination with the warpage value, the heat resistance, and the fastness to bleeding or migration, it makes the orange 34 much less flexible with respect to the types of polymers it can be used in, and compare that to the high performance pigment, the orange 64, which has a much wider applicability within polymers. And both of these chemistries have been reviewed in earlier webinars, and I've made note of which ones they are. So if you have any questions, just let us know, and we can get you those webinars as well. So as far as the future developments for colorants, really the industry is quite mature, and we don't expect new chromophores to be developed anytime soon. So we are prioritizing our efforts to continue to focus on lowering our costs, and as well as improving some of our performance properties like dispersion, and then also in incremental property improvements like heat stability and strength, maybe some durability as well. And from a coloristic perspective, we are always focusing on expanding our hue range, especially for reds, yellows, and oranges in this space. And then we're also always looking and working with our customers to identify any missing or subpar technical properties that might be out there, so that we can always continue to provide our R&D teams some pipeline of ideas that they can work on to make sure that we move these colorant portfolios in a more positive direction with respect to properties and color. We continue to focus on all the global regulations that are required for the plastics industry. So we want to make sure that where needed, all of our products are properly comply properly. And then, of course, we also have the ability to potentially tailor colorants to meet your application need if there's something specific. Obviously, that takes that goes back to making a valid business choice, but we do have that ability. So we talked about a lot of things today, and I did want to recall that we colorants for plastics span over a wide variety of colorants, and so you can see our portfolios here. We have our high performance pigments in the Sudaperm area. Our effect pigments are in the Semica area. The Phthalos are in the Sudafast area, along with some of the classical azos, as well as in the Sudacolor for some of the other azos. Our solvent dyes are in the Sudasol line of of products, and our newly launched CICPs are under the Sudatherm product line of products. Our plastics brochure, we have here, which gives an indication of what's available on the organic side. Obviously, as soon as these are typically printed, they are outdated probably almost the next day, but at least it gives you a feel for what is available from Sudarshan and some of the technical properties that go along with them. As I mentioned at the very beginning, at the end of the presentation is more specific details of all of the products in each color space that are suitable for application or for the plastics application. So next up, we will skip September for the webinar series because Sudarshan is participating in 2 live conferences, technical conferences coming up in September. So we're really thrilled about that. The CAD Retech series will be held in September, and we will have both a technical presentation as well as a booth there. And in addition, we will also be present and giving a paper at the Powder Coating Summit as well in September. So we will skip September. And then in October, we will bring you the CICPs for our webinar series. And then we will take the remaining of the year off as the year-end activities come to a close, and we will pick up the series in January again with solvent dyes. Just to give you a quick look into some of our newest products that we've just launched. Here is the flyer for the Pigment Yellow 164 product, and then also the Pigment Black 28. And then our newest product in this solvent dye line is our Solvent Red 179. So I'm glad to have my the North American team present here. So we are all here to answer any of your questions or any of your technical needs. You can reach out to any one of us. And at this point, I'd like it to open up to any questions that you might have. Put on my glasses here so I can see. Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat box. If there's something pressing, you can certainly join in right now, or you can also contact me directly. and I can answer your questions that way as well. So we wanted to thank you again for participating in our webinar, and we hope that this brings you some value into your activities. And we look forward to seeing you at the CAD Retech show in September, and then also again for our CICP webinar in October. So with that, I will close the session, and once again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you.